The purpose of this screencast is to start taking notes or gathering information. We are in the G phase of the research project Minnesota interviews, and G is for gathering information. We've done our keyword search already and found some sources on the internet. We've evaluated those online sources, and now that we have our 5 online sources, we're ready to start taking notes from them. So let's take a look at the assignment. Purpose. The purpose of this exercise is to effectively gather information from an online source. Well, in order to effectively gather information from an online source, I need to keep my past documents in mind or activities that I've done. I need to remember the questions that I need to have answered. So hopefully I'm answering these questions, I'm reflecting back on this sheet, or I'm going back to it all the time to see, is the website answering some of these questions? Because ultimately they need to. I'm also going to use this website, or this Google Doc, because this Google Doc has my sources on it. And it will tell me kind of what I'm looking for from that source. Because it could have been a little while since you've looked at these sources. So you want to look at the little reminder to see the purpose of why you're going there once again. So you got to have the questions in mind. You have to have your purpose for reading the website in mind. Learnings. Students will be able to effectively navigate an online source. Navigate means move through it. Click on the right things. Find the information that you need. Look at the headings. Look at the pictures. Look at the layout and see if it makes sense to you. Next, students will be able to use a host of reading comprehension skills to glean understanding from an online source. We're primarily using notes, and notes allow you to monitor your reading. You always have to stop and think, is this a worthwhile note to take? And moreover, does this worthwhile note answer a question? So that's what's going to keep you on track. So you're kind of asking questions while you read, as well as asking yourself if what I'm reading is noteworthy. And then finally, students will be able to take good notes from an online source. And we're going to talk about what a good note is in a moment. So specific directions. Watch this think aloud. You're going to watch me navigate, read, and take notes from an online source. Select a source and read from the evaluating sources Google Doc. That is this. So here's where you find your list of sources. Use a Google Doc to take notes from several online sources. Here is the Google Doc, and you will find this on Google Classroom. You can get your own version. And you can repeat this. You're going to need to use several of these. And there's note-taking form 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and even beyond if you have more than 5 sources. Finally, repeat this process until you have taken notes from all 5 sources. So you have 5 sources on this particular Google Doc listed in this table. You want to take notes on all of them. So that takes me to this document, which looks like this. So note-taking form, interviews with Minnesota history. And the layout of the form is you're going to put your source URL up here, as well as the title and the year maybe it was published or last updated, and then the author. Also want to preview, what will this source focus on? So I'm going to preview the text and see what am I going to get out of it, and take a couple bullets there so I know what I'm getting into. Then I have specifics about notes. When you're taking a notes, you want it to be about 3 to 10 words long. You want to use your own words, which is called paraphrasing, and we've been practicing that all year. And you want to include important information, names, dates, places, events, the facts. And then you want to use shorthand. So I think a real common one when you're typing is using abbreviations. Instead of United States, use US. Instead of George Washington, use GW. For my purposes, instead of saying Dred Scott all the time, I could just say Scott, or I could say DS for Dred Scott. That will allow me to move faster through things. And then you take the notes right here. Then you have ideas or questions, thoughts you have about your subject or questions that you still have. So if I come across things that I still want to know after doing the reading and taking notes, I'm going to put it here. just need to have one or two, and it kind of takes you into the next phase of your research. So that's the layout of the note-taking form. Now I'm going to go back here to my evaluating, and I'm going to copy this URL. And before I paste it, I'm going to see this is from PBS, and I'm going to notice that this is kind of a bio of Dred Scott's life, and has a lot of links to other sources telling me what's going on in Dred Scott's life. So I may come back to this if I need to find out the context of Dred Scott's life, what's going on in the antebellum time period in the United States. But for right now, it's a bio. So I'm getting some basics, probably a really good place to start. So I copy the website, and I paste it in the URL, and it takes me here. So here is the website. And for starters, on my note-taking sheet, I need to get that source put in. And so there is the URL, and it is pbs.org. There is no author. More than likely a team of authors. Title is Dred Scott's Fight for Freedom. So right off the bat, when I'm thinking of the title, this is probably going to tell me about the court case, definitely, because that was his fight for freedom. And then year, I think we remember looking at this and not really finding a year that it was last updated. It doesn't seem to be available. Teacher's Guide, Narrative Home, Resource Bank Index, PBS Online, Copyright might have some info. So it looks like, here we go, 1998, 1999. And it doesn't seem to have any more information than that. So I'm going to go with this being 1998, 1999. That's really not that recent, so it hasn't been updated that recently. But we're still going to go with it. So we're approaching 20 years old. And I'm going to preview the site. So looking at it, I think it talks about kind of the importance of Dred Scott's case in the United States. We got some early history of Dred Scott and more early history and his marriage, etc., and where he's from. So we get some kind of life stuff here. And then we get into the trial of Dred Scott, and where he takes his court case for freedom. And this is where maybe Minnesota might be mentioned. More about the trial occurs in this paragraph, and we see more about the trial and decisions, and maybe we got end of life and impacts here. So we're kind of running through his life. So when I come back here, preview, this is a short bio of Scott's life and includes details about the court case. Okay, so this is going to help me answer some questions about early life. So when I come back here, it's going to help me answer some of these early life questions. And also, it's going to help me answer questions about the court case. So it's going to help me answer some of these questions about major event that happened in Dred Scott's life. I probably have some questions here about that major event. This is going to help with that. So let's get started. And remember, coming back to my questions, I may want to go back here and kind of look, now that I know it's about early life, is I know I had questions like when was he born, where was he born, what was the life of an enslaved person like. I also had questions about the major event, is how did it involve Minnesota Territory or Wisconsin Territory at the time? What was Fort Snelling's role in this? Why were Southerners coming up to Minnesota with their enslaved people? Why wouldn't Dred Scott be considered a free person if he was in a free territory? So some of these questions about maybe links to Minnesota or a major event or some of the major accomplishments. Why did he lose? What precedents had to be overturned for Dred Scott to lose? And then back to Minnesota is how did this impact the abolitionist movement in Minnesota? Maybe we'll see some of that information. So I want to have these questions in mind when I go into the reading. All right, start with the reading. Dred Scott first went to trial to sue for his freedom in 1847. So right off the bat, I have a pretty good note, right? And when I'm taking notes, I'm not going to think about organizing them quite yet. I just want to kind of get them out there. So 1847, Dred Scott, case for freedom begins. So I keep things short. I know what that means, even though if somebody just read that without knowing the case, they might not know, but it's more for me. It's in shorthand. 10 years later, after a decade of appeals and court reversals, his case was finally brought before the United States Supreme Court. So he did go to the Supreme Court. And so 10 years later, so 1857, case is before the Supreme Court. In what is perhaps the most infamous case in its history, the court decided that all people of African ancestry, slaves as well as those who were free, could never become citizens of the United States and therefore could not sue in federal court. Wow. So there's something I didn't really fully understand, is that all African Americans were not considered citizens of the United States. African Americans is AA, and maybe free or slave, not considered citizens, could not sue, because he had to be a citizen to sue. The court also ruled that the federal government did not have the power to prohibit slavery in territories. So I'm kind of getting a big overview here. Case showed that slavery was permitted in free territories. That's going to cause some problems, I would imagine. Scott, needless to say, remained a slave. Born around 1800, Scott migrated westward with his master, Peter Blow. Two big notes there. Notice how kind of rigorous this is, so I'm really comprehending a lot of this. Born in 1800, owned by Peter Blow, and that's probably his first owner. They traveled from Scott's home state of Virginia to Alabama and then in 1830 to St. Louis, Missouri. So kind of trajectory of his life. Owned by Peter Blow. Born in Virginia. Moved to Alabama and on to St. Louis, Missouri. Two years later, Peter Blow died. Scott was subsequently bought by Army surgeon Dr. John Emerson, who later took Scott to the free state of Illinois. In the spring of 1836, after a stay of 2.5 years, Emerson moved to a fort in the Wisconsin Territory. So 1836 moves to Wisconsin Territory. This impacts Minnesota. And I'm going to put free territory. So that is impactful. Where slavery was prohibited. But Scott was never, oh, sorry, I jumped up. I am Here. While there, Scott met and married Harriet Robinson, a slave owned by a social justice of the peace. Ownership of Harriet was transferred to Emerson. So Scott married Harriet Robinson. And I want you to notice something. I'm not writing exactly what I read. I'm paraphrasing it. So D.S. married Harriet Robinson. She was owned by Emerson. And what I kind of didn't get here is owned by, brought to Virginia, St. Louis, Missouri. I didn't put down when his ownership transferred. So Peter Ballou died. So before he starts moving up north, Emerson buys him. So I'm going to need to put that here. Emerson buys DS after Blow dies. Okay, I'm going to stop right now. And I kind of thought of a question or two in here, as I have some conflicting information. I thought Peter Blow freed him, so maybe it was descendants of him. So who bought and liberated Scott at the end of his life? Because I thought from what I read in MNOpedia, it was Peter Blow. Maybe I read that wrong, so I have a confusion as my head while I'm reading. Now, from that single source, I only read 2-3 paragraphs, and that's how much I got. You can imagine from one source, you're probably going to get about 25 to 30 notes. So when all is said and done, you're going to have 5 notes. You're going to have well up to about 150 notes on your source or on your topic. So this is kind of a premature version of what your notes page will look like. Also, I want you to remember how I was monitoring what I was reading because I go back and I take a note on it. And when I take a note on it, I'm putting it in my own words. And that allows me to process it. And it keeps me in touch with what's being written and keeps questions fresh in my mind. Notice I'm never copy pasting. That's not allowed. And also, I'm going back or at least thinking about these questions as I'm reading because I finally came across when he was born in this, because that wasn't in the source I read previously. So I would repeat this process now with all 5 of my sources.